Good afternoon, everybody. This is Karen Davila with the Florida Healthcare Law Firm. I'm delighted you're able to join me to discuss the topic of how to protect your pharmacy from risky prescriptions. I am board certified in healthcare law and have practiced pharmacy law for many years. And I have advised many pharmacies on various aspects of their operations, particularly around controlled substances. So I'm delighted to bring this material to you, and we're going to jump right in. Keep in mind, folks, that because this isn't interactive, I won't be able to take questions during the webinar, but if you have questions, you've been given information for how to submit those, and I will gladly answer those after the webinar. So thanks again, and let's get started. So today's materials are pretty extensive. We're going to cover both the current environment at the top of the conversation, as well as what the requirements are for prescriptions. We're also going to talk about what specific risks various pharmacies face today, what resources there are out there for you, how you can build a compliance program, how to conduct a periodic compliance assessment, and the last is a little bit of a bonus. What happens if the government does come knocking at the door? So I think that's an important conversation to be prepared for, but more important is to assure that your pharmacy is in compliance at all times so that if that happens, you don't have anything to worry about. So as I'm sure everybody is aware of, the headlines are frequent about fraud and abuse and opioid takedowns and Operation Heat and so forth. So as you can see from this particular slide, there have been recent headlines about fraud and enforcement in connection with opioid and drug trafficking. And so these are fairly fresh. Take a look at the last one, which is a federal court restraining a Tampa pharmacy and individuals for dispensing opioids or other controlled substances. That just came out a few days ago. And those are allegations against both the pharmacy owner and the pharmacy technician. And the allegations involve ignoring red flags. And so we're going to talk about all of that. But again, I wanted to put the context around and provide some reason for why this topic is important today. So the current environment, let's talk about, first of all, government enforcement. The government enforcement continues to escalate. Those headlines are just a few of the headlines. They are fairly common. And we hear of them all the time. And in Florida, there is quite a bit of emphasis. You'll note here that in March, April of 2018, this is a statement that I thought was particularly relevant. The DEA intends to use every criminal, civil, and regulatory tool possible to target, prosecute, and shut down individuals and organizations responsible for illegal distribution of addictive and potentially deadly pharmaceutical controlled substances. And you'll see some additional stats lower on in this slide. At the end of April, the strike force charged 52 medical professionals up in Appalachia. And again, that's just one more example of enforcement. So under the topic of enforcement occurs under the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, which regulates not just the manufacture and distribution of controlled substances, but also the prescribing and dispensing. And much of the enforcement is with respect to prescribers and pharmacies these days. Each of those entities is a registrant with the DEA and is subject to the DEA rules. Now, the next one is an interesting comment, and I included it here because I find it interesting in the context of how they do what they do. So the DEA's stated policy is to prevent abuse and diversion without adversely impacting legitimate patient needs. The challenge is what the DEA thinks are legitimate patient needs may vary from what physicians think legitimate patient needs are, and maybe even pharmacists. It's not that the DEA is trying to prevent access altogether, but they are not in the best position to determine what are legitimate patient needs in many instances. And so there's a real strain between the DEA and prescribers and pharmacies in attempting to get to the bottom of what patient needs really are. And then in 2018, of course, the Support Act was adopted, and the Support Act focused on reducing access and supply, but it also focused on expanding prevention, treatment, and recovery services. One particularly important fact under the Support for Patients and Communities Act is the requirement for electronic prescribing for controlled substances, except for very limited circumstances. So side by side under Florida law, I thought it might be helpful to see what the prescriber's responsibilities are and what the pharmacy responsibilities are. And by the way, when I talk about pharmacy, I'm really talking about both the pharmacy and the pharmacist. Any owner of a pharmacy is as responsible as the pharmacist for assuring the operations are in compliance with these requirements. So if you look at the prescriber, they are supposed to, prior to prescribing controlled substances, they're supposed to document a history and physical actual visit with the patient. Then they're supposed to develop an individualized treatment plan with stated objectives. And so individualized is very important, particularly when we get to the part where we're going to discuss what these prescriptions look like when they come in. Then in addition, they are supposed to periodically assess and adjust therapy based on a patient's response to the treatment. Alternatives are supposed to be considered and discussed with the patient. And a written controlled substance agreement should be in place between the provider and a patient where a provider is prescribing controlled substances. And at a minimum, the prescriber should see the patient every 3 months, not just renew prescriptions. If there is a pain management purpose and the pain management is not acute pain post-surgery or post some injury, the patient should typically be referred to pain management specialists, particularly where there's potential for addiction or abuse. And it's important to know that the prescriptions, when they're coming in, should have written on them for non-acute pain, non-acute pain. And for acute pain, the prescription for controlled substances should be limited to no more than a 3-day supply. And if there is an exception documented, then 7 days. So now we're going to look at the opposite of this, the pharmacist. And I say opposite, the person who is reviewing the prescription. First of all, the pharmacist should make sure that all of those things have occurred to the best of their ability. But a pharmacist may not dispense a Schedule 2 through 4 to any patient or an agent without first determining that the prescription is valid, which means you have to look at what the prescription requirements are, make sure that they're met. Also, a dispenser must consult the Prescription Drug Monitoring System, eForce, to review a patient's controlled substance dispensing history before dispensing the controlled substance. So those are very important process implications to consider as you're building out how you're going to dispense controlled substances. The current environment, by the way, includes the fact that the DEA is looking at your data, even if you don't know they're looking at your data. They have the ability to mine the data to identify outliers, and they do it routinely. And in fact, many of the pharmacies or pharmacists or prescribers who are on the DEA's radar are there because data has been mined. I recall when I was working for Walmart, meeting with the DEA, because that was just what you did to understand how you're performing, any concerns. The DEA loves to do education, and so with any large providers like that, they tend to invite opportunities for education and so forth. And we learned that they have these reports, and the reports are data where your dispensing practices are compared to other dispensers in the community, in the nation, and they identify outliers. They also look at what the pharmacy has ordered against what has been dispensed, and that there is a reconciliation done with respect to that. They look at the ratio of controlled substances to other legend drugs and the ratio of C2s to other controls. Similarly, they're looking at the ratio of cash for all RXs versus cash for controlled substances. And inevitably, when I've been asked to look at data, I find a difference in how frequently cash is used for all legend drugs versus how frequently cash is used to pay for controlled substances, particularly C2s. The DEA also has the ability to see patients who are on a drug cocktail, and although the most highly targeted cocktail is the Holy Trinity, the reality is a cocktail can be two of the three. And so it's important to understand what the practice looks like and understand your data, because the DEA does. The next one is the frequency with which your pharmacy is filling for high volume controlled substance prescribers, because high volume controlled substance prescribers are the ones on the DEA's radar. It ultimately means where those prescriptions are being filled could be on the radar as well. And then the DEA also looks at the geographic dispersion of these patients, their prescribers, and the pharmacies where prescriptions are being filled. So now let's talk about what is it you can do. That just kind of laid the foundation. Now we're going to look at what you can do to mitigate the risks of filling bad prescriptions. So first and foremost, policies and procedures are critical. Setting expectations for your staff, understanding what your expectations are for them, and making sure they understand as well. So you want to have unambiguous policies and procedures, and you want to make sure the pharmacist is exercising his or her professional judgment. But you should set minimum expectations for evaluating whether to fill each controlled substance prescription. And broadly, those policies should incorporate some of the things I've listed here, things like a validation of patient identification, a review of the patient's drug regimen, whether they're an existing patient at your pharmacy or whether you are looking in eForce as noted below, but you do want to require a review of the patient's data in the Florida eForce or whatever state you're in. It would be the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program database, and I think all states now have one at some point in the last 10 years, 5 years. Missouri didn't have an online database to do so, but I believe all states now have it. And then really preferably direct contact with the prescriber. There were many instances in some of the cases I advised on where communication was with somebody in the prescriber's office, and that person would confirm the prescription was legitimate, only to later find out that person was stealing from the prescriber and or had prescription pads and was forging signatures and stuff. So if at all possible, if you should periodically speak directly with the prescriber and validate that the prescription is legitimate and that there's a valid prescriber-patient relationship. You should also have a policy and procedure for refusal to fill, mandatory reporting to local law enforcement if you refuse to fill because you believe the prescription is fraudulent. Now here, I guess the point I would make is when people say, well, when should I report to law enforcement? If you are refusing to fill because you think the prescription is not written pursuant to a valid prescriber-patient relationship and or is not for a legitimate medical purpose, the prescription is not a legitimate prescription and therefore is fraudulent. So it doesn't have to be a forged prescription, although those must immediately be reported. But forged prescription would be a fraudulent one, as well as a prescription that is not written for appropriate purposes and is not written by a prescriber pursuant to having had a provided medical services to the patient. So in order to be legal, a prescription must be issued by a registered practitioner. The good thing there is your database, whatever operating system you have, should have a verification that the practitioner prescribing is registered. It should also have the ability to verify that the DEA registration is current. And if you're filling any prescriptions for government payers, you should also make sure that the individual who is prescribing is not a sanctioned individual. And nowadays, the operating systems, of course, incorporate this into workflow behind the scenes and will only notify you if the individual doesn't have a valid registration, active, current, valid registration. And then, of course, the rest of those we talked about, the purpose and the relationship. And then it has to be written on a counterproof RX pad or electronically prescribed if it's a controlled substance. It must also include the date issued, the prescriber's signature, and the rest of these items there. Note that for quantity, the quantity should have both the number in letters and in numbers. And again, we talked before, if it's for a C2, it has to be for less than 3 days for acute pain, and for non-acute pain, it has to be marked. So we've all heard that the pharmacists have a corresponding responsibility, but what really does that mean? And the DEA takes this corresponding responsibility seriously, and every enforcement action against pharmacies and pharmacists will mention that the pharmacist or pharmacy failed to perform in accordance with their corresponding responsibility. So let's talk about this. There are some risks associated with prescriptions, and your corresponding responsibility requires you to be eyes wide open when you're evaluating a prescription. So what does that look like? You should be thinking about things like people. What does this prescriber's prescribing habits look like? Who are the pharmacy staff filling, and have you properly vetted your pharmacy staff? And what are your patients? Whether it's you're looking at overall where they're coming from, what types of prescriptions they're filling, their age. Demographics are very helpful, but not the only picture there. And then you want to look at processes. Do you have concerns with loose inventory controls? Do you have high volume of controlled substances that you're ordering? And also changes in your ordering patterns are important. I had a recent case where suddenly some Oxy 30 was ordered in an environment, in an institutional environment where Oxy 30 was not used. And so the question should have been in the pharmacy, why did we order Oxy 30? And when the question came up, it should have been answered that it was an error or something. They should have been returned, whatever. But the minute your order pattern changes, that should trigger somebody to question. And again, all part of the corresponding responsibility to make sure that controlled substance prescriptions are properly filled for patients who need them for a legitimate medical purpose, but not otherwise. And so another process consideration is where your e-force checks are in workflow. It's certainly better than if you simply have a policy that says, and by the way, pharmacist, we expect you, we mandate that you check e-force on every prescription. Because if you have that, then it's not automatically brought in front of the pharmacist, and it requires a step outside of the workflow, might even require them logging onto an internet. Sometimes internet is not a particularly effective connection, and so pharmacists will find it difficult to do some of those things if they're outside of workflow. So building it into your workflow and into your operating system, having that automatically feed is a far superior solution to mitigate the red flags. In addition, where there is limited contact with prescribers, that can raise red flags. If you call the prescriber's office and they balk at getting on the phone to speak with you, or you get if you have any reason to think it doesn't feel right, it doesn't seem that the prescriber understands the seriousness of your concerns, that raises red flags, and as a pharmacist, you need to be thinking about it. And then also, I would make sure that you have a process and an expectation that your pharmacists document their efforts to verify the RX. So wherever you have a controlled substance prescription, you'd expect to see more documentation than you would in other cases. With respect to systems, there are circumstances where you have poorly enforced security controls, whether it's access into the pharmacy or access to the systems where people are sharing passwords and so forth, particularly if it's the ordering system, CSOS, or any other process through which you order your controlled substances. And then cameras and other security systems are pretty critical. So if you don't have those, it's difficult to have effective security, particularly if you have to investigate controlled substance losses. So here are some of the many resources that can be used to support your pharmacist in their fulfilling their corresponding responsibility. You've got prescription drug monitoring program. You've also got the prescriber. And again, I point out the prescriber is indeed a resource. And if you're building relationships with prescribers, you're going to have higher quality and more compliant pharmacy and dispensing practices. And of course, your national and state associations are always helpful with additional best practices and so forth. So if you want to build out a compliance program for your pharmacy, you really should make somebody responsible for developing it and implementing it. It would include the review of the policies and procedures or establishing policies and procedures if they don't exist. And by the way, it is not uncommon when I've gone in and done evaluations like this to find that there is no policy on what to do if you refuse to fill a prescription. And I think that's a very important policy. So I kind of want to put that at the top of your thoughts, because most of the other policies are at least built out, but maybe expectations around them are not as clear. So again, developing those policies and procedures, making sure expectations are clear, making sure there is somebody responsible for developing, implementing the compliance program. Step 2, we've talked about already. The policies and procedures should relate specifically to the corresponding responsibilities that the pharmacists have. There should be a process for obtaining, reviewing documentation that supports both the medical purpose and the relationship between the prescriber and the patient. There should be a requirement to do periodic drug regimen review, both internally and using eForce. Quantities and day supply controls are very difficult to enforce, but if you know that there is a requirement to limit controlled C2s to a 3-day supply for an acute pain purpose, and you see something beyond that, you should be documenting. You should make sure that your policies require documentation around those types of controls. Of course, physical security, and again, both for the pharmacy as a whole, then for your systems and for your controlled C2 cabinet or wherever you store your C2s. And your regular controlled substances, C3 through 5, should also be carefully monitored. System logons and IT controls, we've talked a bit about. Pharmacist consultation. Pharmacist consultation there should be a very specific policy around this about what expectations are, because pharmacists frequently glean a fair amount of information from consulting with the patient. And by doing so, it may provide additional context for a particular prescription and help resolve what the DEA refers to as red flags. There should be a process policy for documenting the various interactions and review of prescriptions. And there should be disciplinary guidelines and prompt corrective action, particularly as it relates to controlled substances. So as you continue and you've built out the program, then you need to conduct your training. You need to do training for everybody who's responsible for fulfilling the expectations as set forth in your policies and procedures. It's very important also to establish a culture of compliance. Clearly, communication, open communication between an owner, a pharmacy manager, a line or staff pharmacist, a pharmacy tech. If the communication is good, questions will be welcome. And when questions are welcome, people feel free to ask them and challenge things. This is a little along the lines of the see something, say something. You want people to know that you are interested in understanding if there are problems or concerns that your staff is observing. It allows you to identify the risks and mitigate them early. In terms of the pharmacy's compliance with policies and procedures, here the purpose is to make sure that you're not just drafting policies and procedures and putting them on a shelf. Although that's a good first step, it is not sufficient. And so periodically you want to review and satisfy yourself that the policies and procedures are being followed. So we'll talk a little bit about a process for how to do that. You'll want to look at documentation. You'll want to review PDMP or e-force utilization and documentation. In terms of that, historically, if it wasn't in workflow, we took the approach to periodically run access reports from the PDMP to see how frequently our individual pharmacists were checking the state drug monitoring program website. So it's very important if your e-force or PDMP checks are not in workflow that you periodically do that. And use other data analysis and industry benchmarks. And then with any monitoring or auditing program, you should always incorporate corrective action based upon any gaps you find after doing your assessment. So how do you do an assessment? What should you be looking at? How do you take in all the information that is available to you? So you should, if you conduct a walkthrough of the pharmacy, you'll be surprised, but you'll see a lot of things. And when you do that with your eyes open, with a view toward security, towards just the physical observation with respect to controlled substances, it will help you in enhancing your compliance program. So for example, are controlled substances properly secured? Are there cameras where your controlled substances are? Is the controlled substance cabinet locked? And so forth. Your physical walkthrough should also include an evaluation of your computers, just checking to see if computers are automatically logged off. They should be set to log off fairly quickly after somebody steps away. So that's important to consider. In terms of controlled substance orders, you want to take a look at what controlled substances have been ordered. Again, I mentioned earlier looking for a change in ordering patterns. You also want to compare against your dispensing logs and try to understand, and your inventory, and try to understand whether you have any controlled substance loss concerns. It's clearly one of the risks in a pharmacy setting. The next thing you should be looking at generally is the external area around the pharmacy. If you have a waiting area, who's in that waiting area? What's the waiting area look like? Are people lining up when the pharmacy opens first thing in the morning? Are people showing up at 5 o'clock at night just as you're closing, trying to get a controlled substance prescription filled? Those are all things that you can observe during a physical walkthrough. Very important to pay attention to those physical signs. And then evaluate the physical security of pharmacy. You can run from most security systems, you can run access logs and look at those and see if the access is appropriate. Oftentimes, some of what we're talking about is used more in the context of investigating controlled substance loss, but nonetheless can be performed at any point during an assessment. So the next thing you would want to do, and I find this particularly helpful in understanding what's happening, what the environment is in a pharmacy, is to interview members of the staff. You want to know that they understand what the policies and procedures and expectations are. You want to observe behavior. You want to know if you have either patients with concern, and staff often will be the first to identify that. So if you're interviewing members of the staff, you should ask them, do we have any patients that are a particular concern for you? Have you seen any issues that you want to bring to our attention? You'll want to interview them regarding how they use their computer logins, how frequently, how well they're using the information from the eForce or the PMP. And you'll want to see, first of all, you want to confirm what they understand is the expectation regarding a refusal to fill. In many instances, as I said, I have observed pharmacies that don't really have a formal process for documenting a refusal to fill and don't know what to do with the prescription and don't know who to escalate it to. And so it's very important that when you build out that policy, you say, first of all, if you get a prescription that you do not think is a legitimate prescription, keep it, apologize to the patient, and you don't have to return it. If they insist on you returning the actual prescription, make sure you get a copy of the prescription first and return it. Once you've done that, you can report it to local law enforcement. You can make a log of it. You could report it to there are a number of things you can do. And so I just want to make sure you think through what the process is. And then the last is observations around prescribers. In order to do that, you're probably going to have to look at your data, and that is one of the pieces of your assessment anyway. So let's move on, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So when you're doing your pharmacy assessment, you will want to mine your data. Your pharmacy operating system can be a source of information, a wealth of information. Matter of fact, you will want to put your data into a spreadsheet and then analyze that for prescriber patterns. So you want to see how many people are using a particular prescriber. You'll want to see what that prescriber's prescribing patterns are and whether they're doing individualized treatments. This is particularly true with prescribers who get in the you'll see they get in the habit of using only one drug. They prescribe one drug, and let's say it's Oxy 30 just for the sake of it. They prescribe Oxy 30, and then they're always prescribing 100, and that typically means there's a chronic pain issue. And then you should be questioning what the specialty of the prescriber is, because if the prescriber is not a pain management physician, but the patient has been on that drug quite a bit, that should be a red flag, and you want to pay attention to that. So you can mine your data for all of these things: the duration of the treatment, the dosage, whether they start with lower dose and go up to higher. And oftentimes you'll find that they jump in right at a very high dose of an opioid, and there has been no attempt to consider alternatives. And so it's important to evaluate those. Other things that you'll see in your data, and I think this is important because most pharmacies aren't paying attention to this from my experience, is that there are patients who have same or similar addresses. They'll be from the same building, they'll be in the same actual address, but completely different names. And that while they may be extended families, it just raises yet another red flag to understand the relationship of patients to each other. And that's particularly true where the address is geographically distant from a pharmacy or geographically distant from the prescriber. All of those locational data points are important in getting kind of an overarching view of your data. So you'll want to run the data a lot of different ways, and you'll want to, one last thing that I didn't mention yet is your controlled substance pricing. One of the things that you won't be able to do looking at your own data, but you should shop if you can, or try to understand how you're priced. When you price your controlled substances lower than your competitors, you will get more volume, and it will automatically force your data to be skewed because people are in fact seeking controlled substances, and because a lot of those controlled substances are paid for by cash, particularly the cash paying customers are shopping for price. So important to keep in mind all of that. Once you've got your data and reports, you start analyzing it. You can run the report. If it's in Excel, you can, this is very simple. This is not rocket science. You can sort the report looking for the geographic patterns. You can sort the report looking for prescriber patterns. So sort it all by prescriber and then figure out are all the patients from the same family, from the same geographic area. Are you seeing something about that? Is the prescriber routinely prescribing only one controlled substance? So forth. The familial patterns we talked about, it can be very strange to see multiple family members with the exact same diagnosis and the same controlled substance. So where you see that, it might raise a red flag. And then also you want to be analyzing the data that comes from your inventory reconciliation to look for any anomalies. What all of this does for you, and I hope what you've seen, is there's no one data point that's going to answer the question whether you're filling controlled substance prescriptions in a safe manner. A multi-dimensional perspective is the best way to view your data. Put that lens on, put your data in a spreadsheet, shake it up a bit, see what you're able to see, and it's amazing what you will find. And doing so, you should document that periodically as part of this periodic compliance and quality review. Once you've got that information, you should be able to identify one or more gaps. So this includes not just your data analysis, but the interviews with the staff, the physical observations, and so forth. And as they used to say in the shampoo commercials, lather, rinse, repeat. What I'm saying here is when you have done a pharmacy assessment, you're not done. You have to make sure you are consistently adhering to all of these regulatory constraints and best practices. As a result, you'll want to repeat the pharmacy assessment periodically. And I don't mean a comprehensive assessment every month, but every 6 months or every year might be appropriate depending on the size of your pharmacy. So this last bit of information is really a bonus because I want you to be thinking about this as you're writing your policies and procedures. If you've done everything right up to this point and you've got great policies and procedures and you've built out expectations for your pharmacy staff, you've created a culture of compliance, They understand that if they see something, they should say something. You've done an assessment, you've documented any corrective action for what gaps you found. You're in great shape. But even so, when you're drafting the policies and procedures, I'd like to think that you will put some effort into building out a process to respond to a government inquiry. Now, I'm talking here about a physical arrival at your pharmacy, but oftentimes you could get a written request for records. It can come in a number of forms. It can come from a number of agencies, whether it's the Florida regulatory bodies or the DEA or other regulatory enforcement like the DOJ, the Department of Justice. It's important for you to be prepared for how to respond. So the first thing would be you have a policy. The policy should be part of the training with your staff. And although with your staff, the policy is what to do if you receive a document or if somebody shows up at the door, the emergency really is when somebody knocks down the door, right? That's the emergency. So some of this will apply to more that scenario than a written request for documents or a subpoena or whatever. So assure your employees, particularly if you're the owner of the pharmacy, assure that your employed pharmacists have contact information for emergencies, such as a government visit. You should require the person in charge, whether, and I would say that's likely to be a pharmacist who's on site, because the pharmacy should never be open if there's not a pharmacist on site. And I'm sure it goes without saying, but you should never dispense prescriptions unless there is a pharmacist in the pharmacy at the time of dispensing. So now back to what we're talking about here. They should notify the supervisor, the owner, if it's a smaller pharmacy, if they're contacted by an investigator outside of work also. The pharmacy, and I suggest this for all of my healthcare clients, is they should have an attorney who has expertise in regulatory enforcement on a retainer or standby, so that in the event something bad does happen and you need somebody quickly, they're ready to help you. They know your pharmacy, they know what you need, and they're ready to jump in and support your organization as it goes through whatever that immediate emergency is. So when they're at your door, it is very important to start collecting information immediately. You want to know it's a legitimate visit. You don't want to let just random strangers in. So you want to make sure your staff know to obtain the business card or identity for each person on your premises. You should do it just like you're taking an attendance at a meeting. Name, the agency affiliation, their contact phone number, and address. Obviously, you want your staff to be courteous and polite, but they should also ask for the reason for the visit. And if there is a subpoena or warrant, they should request a copy. It is important, by the way, that they are not viewed as obstructing or interfering with the search. So there is a balance between being polite and courteous and respectful and protecting your business. So do not obstruct or interfere with the search, but definitely engage in the conversation to get the information on the identity of the individuals and the reason for the visit. If there is a subpoena or warrant, you should ask for a copy of it as soon as they arrive, so that the purpose is well understood, as well as the scope, because you do not want to provide anything beyond the scope of the subpoena or the warrant. So we've talked about cooperating with the search, but there are some key words I want you to think about. The staff should not consent to the search. They do not have the authority to do so. They should request the investigator to wait for the person in charge, whoever it is you've designated per your policy. You do not want your staff removing, altering, or destroying documents. So this is not a a flurry of activity to shred documents as the regulatory authorities are at the door. They produce whatever records there are that are within the scope of the subpoena or warrant. They do not remove, alter, or destroy anything with the regulators there. They should cooperate in the production of appropriate records. So, for example, if the regulators, the enforcement authorities are asking for documents, your staff should point to those documents. Again, I would go back to the scope of the subpoena or warrant and make sure that what they're requesting is within the scope of that. If staff participate in providing things that are beyond the scope, it can be a challenge, or it can be difficult to challenge the production of those later once they've been provided. You can't say that they shouldn't have been provided, they were outside the scope. So you have to be very careful about that. And this last one is fairly important. I want you to be thinking about how your staff, what you want the staff to do in terms of recording what documents are produced. I have suggested in many instances, and it really depends on the setting, the environment. So in a small pharmacy, I don't know if this, is effective or if you have staff who are comfortable doing this, but if you're there, you should immediately begin videotaping and make record on your videotape of any objections made by the agents about keeping copies or the record. Make a record of that refusal on the videotape if possible. I find that very helpful if you're later defending your business and the enforcement agencies acted inappropriately in some manner. So the person in charge, whoever it is you've designated per your policy, should object to the search. They should object to the search on the basis that it's unjustified, because you'll gladly cooperate with the investigation. And by the way, I want to share with you, sometimes these drop-ins where the government arrives and says they are executing a search and seizure warrant or whatever occur on a Friday night, 5 o'clock-ish or something like that. They try to do it at that time in part because if there are people you want to notify of it, they're difficult to get a hold of. And so there is some strategy to that. But as soon as you can get a person in charge on site or on the phone, they should object to the search and say that we'll gladly cooperate. Just let us know what you need and we'll produce it. Typically, these things are much easier done in a subpoena and a request for records. But when they want to make a statement or they're concerned that things will disappear because they have somebody who is conducting themselves inappropriate, then the search and seizure warrant is executed in person, and you'll find that they're trying to get that information live right on site. Request an opportunity to consult with the pharmacy's attorney. Again, remember I said phone a friend. You should have somebody on call, on retainer, somebody who you trust, who knows your pharmacy's operations and can support you in the event something like this occurs. And the pharmacy's attorney should be put in direct contact with the lead investigator. Now, in an emergency, the attorney might not be immediately available. So the person in charge, once they've gotten the identity of all of the individuals on site, they know who is the investigator that's heading up the case. You can obtain the name of the prosecutor, and the person in charge then should call the prosecutor and request that the search be stopped. Monitor and record the details of the search. We've talked about that. Make sure you have a record of that. And then obtain from the lead investigator, and this is normal, this is standard protocol. The investigators who come on site who are taking things from the site will provide an inventory of documents and equipment and items seized. And they should leave that at the time they walk out the door. If it's not available at the time, it would be somewhat unusual, but you should request it immediately or have your attorney do that. You should never consent to search beyond the scope of the warrant because, again, I mentioned earlier, it makes it difficult to defend if you've produced something that you didn't have to produce. Oftentimes, staff are, well, as you can imagine, they're terrified when they're being asked to interview. It is important that they know, and this is why having a policy is helpful. It's important that they know that the interview is voluntary. Typically, the law enforcement folks won't necessarily say it's voluntary, and unless the staff is being arrested, they're not going to be read their Miranda rights necessarily. And I know a lot of you are aware of what that is, if only from television, right? But in the case where they're not being arrested, they're not going to be read their Miranda rights. And so they need to know that the interview is voluntary. But if they decline to be interviewed, they can be subpoenaed to testify. They can be subpoenaed for an interview. They can be held. They could be arrested at some point if they're a part of a problem. So they just need to know that the interview is voluntary. They have no obligation to consent. And even if they start the interview, they can stop the interview at any time. And so again, build this into your policy so they know this. And individuals, your staff members, can have an attorney present during an interview. The pharmacy should have its own attorney, should have that in place, and the staff may have the right to get their own attorneys, because the pharmacy attorney may not be able to represent both, because there will be potentially a conflict of interest. So we talked about a lot. We've been going about 50 minutes now. I just want to summarize kind of the highlights. I want you to think about what we talked about. You should know your patient. What is it you need to know about your patients? We've talked about that. You need to know where they're coming from, who they saw. You need to know what medicines they're on. You need to be checking periodically that they're not on too many controlled substances. Make sure they have a valid patient-prescriber relationship. You should know your prescribers. Well, how do you get to know the prescribers? You should know their specialty, because that will help you determine whether the prescription is appropriate given the specialty. You should know where they practice, and if they are pain management specialists, you should be understanding what their practice looks like, and you should understand their prescribing patterns. You should know your market. What do I mean by that? In general, there are places where drug trafficking is a greater risk, and so understanding what your market looks like and where folks are that are conducting themselves inappropriately or diverting controlled substances, using them inappropriately, you should be aware of that. And once you've got them in place, you should periodically assess policies and procedures, your pricing with respect to controlled substances, and your data. And we talked quite a bit about the data and what the data can tell you. It's a wealth of knowledge for you. So I want to, again, thank you for joining us. My contact information is on the screen. Feel free to jot that down. Reach out to me if you have questions about the presentation today. We are always glad to help those of you who need any help, whether it's developing policies and procedures, doing an operations or risk assessment, and helping you develop corrective action to improve your operations and reduce the risks of filling risky prescriptions. So with that, I will close out the webinar, and I thank you again all for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to the opportunity to serve you, each and every one of you, at some point in the future. Thank you. Have a great day.